The ton of London thrives on two things: imported silk and ruined reputations. When the Duke of Westford announced his marriage to a woman the gossip rags dubbed the Grey Mouse of Gloucestershire, society sharpened its claws. They expected a frightened, stuttering girl to tear apart for sport. They expected a tragedy. They got a reckoning instead. This is the story of a marriage born of cold convenience, and the night a plain bride brought an empire of snobs to its knees. The floorboards in Mr. Abernathy's office smelled of stale tobacco and desperation. Beatrice sat rigid in the high-backed leather chair, her hands folded over the worn wool of her morning dress. The fabric was too heavy for April, but poverty did not afford seasonal wardrobes. She kept her gaze fixed on the brass paperweight on the desk. A hound chasing a fox, fitting. Across from her sat Arthur Grafton, the Duke of Westford. He did not look like a man seeking a bride. He looked like a man preparing to buy a horse he already disliked. His posture was impeccable, born of military discipline rather than drawing-room etiquette. His dark coat was brushed free of lint, his cravat tied with severe precision. There was a hardness to his jaw, a permanent tension around his eyes that suggested he slept poorly and trusted no one. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries, Miss Halling," Arthur said. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges, lacking the polished drawl of his peers. "You are in debt. Deeply." "My late father was in debt, Your Grace," Beatrice corrected softly. Her voice did not waver. She was terrified, yes, but panic was a luxury she could not afford. "I am merely the collateral." Arthur's eyes flicked up, locking onto hers. They were a startling, cold blue, assessing, weighing, finding her lacking, no doubt. She knew what he saw. Mud-brown hair pulled into a severe, unforgiving knot, a complexion dulled by years of staying indoors, avoiding her father's drunken rages. Spectacles that sat slightly crooked on a nose she considered too sharp. She was 24, an ancient spinster by society's brutal arithmetic, and completely devoid of the blooming, rosy charm that commanded high prices in the marriage mart. "Your father owed £50,000 to a syndicate of men who do not send polite letters of collection," Arthur said, leaning back. "They send men with heavy boots and iron pipes. They will take this house. They will take your meager belongings, and then they will take you to a place where your virtue will be bartered for coppers." He wasn't trying to frighten her. He was stating facts. Beatrice appreciated facts. They were solid. You could build a plan on facts. "And you, Your Grace, require a wife." She adjusted her spectacles, pushing them up the bridge of her nose. "Before your 30th birthday next month, or the entailment on the primary Westford estate collapses and the property reverts to the crown." A muscle feathered in Arthur's jaw. He did not like that she had done her research. "Precisely. I need a wife. What I do not need is a duchess. I have no interest in courtship, romance, or the vapid theatrics of London society. I require a signature on a parish registry, a woman who will manage my household without bankrupting it on Parisian lace, and who will leave me in peace." "You want a ghost," Beatrice said. "Why? I want a partnership of mutual indifference," Arthur countered. "I will pay your father's debts. I will establish a generous allowance for your personal use. You will have the protection of my name, which is considerable. In exchange, you will ask no questions of my time, demand no affections I cannot give, and manage Westford Manor with competence. We need not even share a bed, save for the rare occasions necessary to produce an heir, should you wish to secure your position entirely. Though I am indifferent to the prospect." It was a cold, brutal proposition. To any other woman, it would have been an insult. To Beatrice, it was a lifeline. She looked at her hands. The knuckles were red from washing her own linens. Her stomach gave a dull ache, a reminder of the watery porridge she had eaten for breakfast. Love was a fiction penned by men who wanted to keep women foolish. Security was real. A warm fire was real. "I require one amendment," Beatrice said, lifting her chin. Arthur's eyes narrowed. "I am not in the habit of negotiating, Miss Halling. You will establish a trust for my younger sister Clara, £5,000, locked away until she is 21, inaccessible to anyone but her. She is currently at school in Bath. I will not have her face this room or a man like you when she comes of age." Silence stretched over the dusty office. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like hammer strikes. Arthur studied her. He looked at her severe hair, her rigid spine, the total absence of coquetry in her demeanor. 10,000, he said softly. Beatrice blinked. 10,000 for the sister, Arthur repeated, standing up. He towered over her, a massive shadow blocking the pale spring light from the window. Because if you are shrewd enough to bargain with the devil for your kin, you are exactly the manager I need for my estates. We wed on Thursday. Wear something less depressing. He walked out, leaving the door ajar. Beatrice exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that rattled in her chest. She had sold her life, but she had bought her sister's freedom. London did not welcome Beatrice. It tolerated her, much like one tolerates a damp draft in a grand hallway. The transition from the decaying Gloucestershire cottage to the opulent sprawl of Westford House in Mayfair was violent. The house was a monument to wealth, gilded mirrors, marble floors imported from Italy, tapestries that depicted triumphant battles. Beatrice felt like a smudge of dirt on a pristine canvas. The servants took their cues from their master's absence. Arthur had deposited her at the grand entrance, introduced her briefly to Mrs. Higgins, the formidable housekeeper, and immediately departed for his club. He had barely spoken 3 words to her during the carriage ride. "We did not expect His Grace to return with a bride so suddenly," Mrs. Higgins noted on that first day, her eyes scanning Beatrice's plain gray traveling dress. The word she wanted to use was not suddenly. It was drab. "Efficiency is a virtue, Mrs. Higgins," Beatrice had replied, keeping her tone flat. She did not attempt to win the woman over. Servants in grand houses respected authority, not sweetness. "I will review the household accounts tomorrow morning at 9. Have them brought to the morning room." Mrs. Higgins bristled, but nodded. The true test, however, did not come from the staff. It came 3 days later, when the invitations began to arrive. The ton was rabid with curiosity. The Duke of Westford, a wealthy, brooding catch, had married a nobody. They wanted to see the creature. Arthur instructed her to attend a morning tea hosted by Lady Githa Morales. Githa is a cousin of sorts. She holds considerable sway. If you survive her drawing room, the rest of the season will be quiet, he told Beatrice over a sprawling mahogany dining table. They sat at opposite ends, separated by yards of polished wood and silver candelabras. "Am I to be presented as a curiosity, then?" Beatrice asked, cutting her toast. "You are to be presented as my wife. What they make of it is their affair. Do not let them see you bleed." It was the closest thing to advice he had given her. Lady Githa's drawing room was suffocatingly warm, smelling of heavy rose perfume and sweet pastries. When Beatrice was announced, the chatter died instantly. Dozens of eyes, sharp and bright as polished knives, turned toward the doorway. Beatrice stood there. She had worn her best gown, a modest navy blue silk that was 5 years out of fashion. She had pinned her hair tightly. She knew she looked like a governess who had wandered into the wrong room. Lady Githa, a stunning woman with spun gold hair and a gown of frothing pink muslin, glided forward. Her smile was brilliant and entirely devoid of warmth. Your Grace," Githa purred, extending a hand. "We are simply thrilled. Arthur's always been so secretive. We assumed he would bring back a French countess, or perhaps a Russian heiress, but he always did have a penchant for charity." A soft titter rippled through the room. Beatrice did not flush. She did not look away. She met Githa's malicious blue eyes and felt a profound, exhausting emptiness. These women had no concept of the world she had survived. They fought wars with fans and whispers. She had fought wars with creditors and hunger. "My husband is a practical man, Lady Githa," Beatrice said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "He understands the value of a solid foundation over a decorative facade, both in houses and in marriages." The titters stopped. Githa's smile tightened, the skin around her eyes pulling taut. "How terribly sensible," Githa managed. She gestured to a chair in the corner. "Do sit. We were just discussing the upcoming masquerade ball at Vauxhall, though I imagine large social gatherings are quite overwhelming for a country girl. For the next 2 hours, Beatrice was systematically ignored. She was the ghost Arthur had wanted. The women talked over her, around her, past her. They discussed modistes she could not afford, scandals she did not understand, and people she had never met. Every so often, a barb was thrown her way, a comment about how sensible dark colors were for hiding stains, a faux pitying remark about the poor soil in Gloucestershire. Beatrice sat still. She drank her tea. She watched. She catalogued their weaknesses. Lady Githa's husband was notoriously unfaithful. The tight manic edge to her laughter betrayed her anxiety. The young Miss Danvers, who mocked Beatrice's spectacles, had a slight tremor in her hand when holding her teacup. Debts, perhaps? Invisibility was a weapon, Beatrice realized as she rode back to Westford House alone. When people thought you were nothing, they showed you exactly who they were. But as she stepped into the echoing, empty foyer of her new home, the weight of the afternoon pressed down on her. Arthur was out again. He was always out. She had traded the terror of poverty for the suffocating chill of isolation. She walked up the sweeping staircase to her separate bedchamber, the silence of the house ringing in her ears. She sat at her vanity and looked in the mirror. The gray mouse. That was what she was to them. That was what she was to Arthur. She took off her spectacles. The world went slightly soft at the edges. She pulled the heavy pins from her hair, letting the heavy brown mass fall over her shoulders. It wasn't actually mud brown. In the candlelight, it had deep, warm undertones of chestnut. She touched her cheek. She was not a beauty. She would never have Githa's spun gold perfection, but she was not dead yet. A heavy, cream-colored envelope sat on her dressing table. It was the formal invitation to the Vauxhall masquerade, to be held in 3 weeks' time. Arthur had told her she did not have to go. "I abhor these affairs," he had said that morning. "You may decline. No one will blame you for avoiding the spectacle." They expected her to hide. They wanted her to cower in Westford House, managing the accounts, a pathetic, plain joke that Arthur had played on himself. Beatrice traced the embossed gold lettering of the invitation. The cynicism that had protected her for 24 years hardened into something new, something sharp. She didn't want to hide anymore. The preparation began in absolute secrecy. If Beatrice was going to step into the viper's nest, she would not do it in out-of-date navy silk, and she would not do it relying on Arthur's wealth to purchase a disguise. She needed armor, and she knew exactly how to forge it. Before her father had drunk away their fortune, Beatrice's mother had been alive. Her mother had been a French émigré, a woman who possessed little money but a terrifying, brilliant eye for construction. From her, a young Beatrice had learned the mathematics of fabric. She knew how silk behaved on the bias, how velvet drank the light, how boning could reshape a silhouette not by crushing it, but by lifting it. Beatrice did not go to the fashionable modistes in Mayfair. They would report back to Githa Morales within the hour. Instead, she took a hired hackney, leaving the crest-emblazoned ducal carriage in the Mews, to a narrow soot-stained street in Covent Garden. She found the shop she was looking for tucked between a greengrocer and a defunct tavern. Madame Rosier, theatrical costumes and alterations. The bell chimed weakly as she entered. The shop was dark, smelling of dust, camphor, and dying roses. A short, stout woman with graying hair and a tape measure draped like a rosary around her neck emerged from the back. "We are closed to new commissions," Madame Rosier grunted in heavily accented English, eyeing Beatrice's drab gray cloak. "I am not seeking a commission," Beatrice replied in flawless, rapid French. "I am seeking sanctuary, a sewing machine, and your finest bolt of midnight blue silk. I will pay you for the use of your back room, and I will pay double the market rate for the materials." Madame Rosier paused. She looked Beatrice up and down, her eyes narrowing as she registered the precise pronunciation, the rigid spine, the quiet authority. She named an exorbitant price. Beatrice paid it in cash from her allowance, right there on the counter. For the next 3 weeks, Beatrice lived a double life. To Arthur and the staff at Westford House, she was the perfect invisible duchess. She balanced the ledgers with ruthless efficiency, discovering 2 areas where the estate manager had been siphoning funds. She presented the evidence to Arthur one evening in his study. He had looked at the ledgers, then up at her, genuine surprise flickering in his cold blue eyes. "You found this in a week?" "Numbers do not lie, Your Grace," Beatrice had said smoothly, turning to leave. "Men do." Beatrice. She had stopped at the door. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. It felt strange in his low, rough voice. "Thank you," he said. She had merely nodded and walked away. She didn't want his gratitude. She wanted her independence. Every afternoon, while Arthur attended to Parliament or his clubs, Beatrice slipped away to Covent Garden. In the dusty back room of Madame Rosier's shop, the gray mouse shed her skin. The dress was a marvel of engineering. Beatrice abandoned the high empire waists that were currently in fashion, which made her look like a sturdy pillar. Instead, she dropped the waistline slightly, echoing a slightly older, more dangerous silhouette. She used the midnight blue silk, layering it with an overlay of sheer black organza. When she moved, the fabric didn't just swish, it shifted like deep water under a moonless sky. She spent hours on the bodice, using subtle boning to force her posture from rigid defense into regal defiance. It squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. She lowered the neckline, not to the point of scandal, but enough to expose the elegant line of her collarbone and the pale, untouched skin of her chest. "You are hiding a dangerous woman under that gray wool, madame," Rosier commented one afternoon, watching Beatrice pin a seam. The older woman had moved from suspicion to grudging respect over the weeks. "I'm hiding a survivor," Beatrice corrected quietly around a mouthful of pins. The most crucial element was the mask. The invitation mandated one. Beatrice refused a simple domino mask. She crafted a half mask of stiffened black velvet, rimmed with tiny, almost imperceptible jet beads that caught the light like crushed glass. It covered her eyes and nose, sweeping up at the temples like raven wings. It allowed her to remove her spectacles without revealing her bare face. On the afternoon of the masquerade, Arthur knocked on the door of her sitting room. He stepped inside, looking profoundly uncomfortable. He was dressed in standard evening wear, though he carried a simple black silk mask. "You do not have to attend," Arthur said, pacing to the window and looking out at the fading London light. "I know how Githa and her circle treated you. I am aware of the whispers. I can make our excuses." Beatrice sat by the unlit hearth, an embroidery hoop in her lap. She was wearing her usual drab day dress. "Are you ashamed of me, Arthur?" she asked. The question was flat, devoid of self-pity. He turned sharply. "No, I'm ashamed of them. They are vicious, idle creatures who resent anything they cannot understand or control. You have done nothing but bring order and peace to this house. You do not deserve their mockery." It was a surprisingly fierce defense. Beatrice felt a strange, tight pulling sensation in her chest. He was a hard man, but he was not a cruel one. "I will be ready at 8, she said simply. Arthur sighed, clearly thinking she was marching to her own execution. "As you wish. Wear whatever you like. It does not matter to me." He left. Beatrice stood up, dropping the embroidery hoop. It was time. The transformation took exactly 1 hour. There were no giggling maids, no heated curling irons singing the air, no frantic last-minute adjustments. Beatrice worked alone. She locked her bedchamber door and stripped away the gray wool of her daily existence, letting it fall into a discarded heap on the Aubusson rug. When she slid the midnight blue silk over her shoulders, the cold fabric felt like a shock to her system. She turned to the floor-length cheval glass. The woman looking back was a stranger. The subtle boning of the bodice forced her shoulders back, lifting her chin, elongating her neck. The sheer black organza overlay muted the brilliant blue beneath, making the dress appear like a bruised, stormy sky. She secured the jet-beaded mask over her eyes. Without her spectacles, the edges of the room blurred into soft shadows, but she did not need to see the corners of the room. She only needed to see the path forward. To hide the gown, she wrapped herself in a voluminous, heavily hooded black velvet traveling cloak. It completely swallowed her silhouette. Arthur was waiting in the foyer. He wore a severe black evening coat, his white cravat tied with sharp, unyielding precision. A simple black domino mask dangled from his gloved fingers. When Beatrice descended the stairs, bundled in her shapeless cloak, his expression did not change. He offered his arm. She took it. The carriage ride to Vauxhall Gardens was suffocatingly silent. Rain had threatened all afternoon, leaving the London air thick and humid. The rhythmic clatter of iron-shod wheels on cobblestones sounded like a ticking clock. Arthur stared out the window, at the passing gas lamps. He looked exhausted. The tension in his shoulders was a permanent fixture, a man eternally bracing for an attack. "You may stay by my side tonight," Arthur said suddenly, breaking the silence without turning his head. "I will not have them corner you. If Githa or her sycophants attempt to engage you in their usual blood sport, I will intervene." Beatrice looked at his sharp profile in the flickering carriage light. He meant it. He thought she was a fragile, terrified thing that needed a shield. It was a strange, clumsy attempt at gallantry from a man who claimed to want mutual indifference. "That is kind of you, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, her voice muffled slightly by the high collar of her cloak. "But I assure you, I am quite capable of surviving a ball." Arthur finally looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly at her tone. But the carriage jolted to a halt before he could reply. Vauxhall Gardens was a glittering, chaotic inferno of vice and high society. Thousands of colored glass lanterns were strung through the elms, casting an otherworldly, feverish glow over the gravel paths. Music bled from the grand orchestra pavilion, a frantic, swelling waltz that clashed with the roars of laughter, the clinking of crystal, and the pop of champagne corks. It was a place designed for bad behavior. Behind the anonymity of silk and papier-mâché masks, dukes behaved like dock workers, and countesses behaved like courtesans. As they stepped out of the carriage, the sheer wall of noise hit Beatrice like a physical blow. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She forced it down. Fear was a luxury. Arthur secured his mask over his face. The black silk threw his piercing blue eyes into stark relief. He offered his arm again. "Keep close," he ordered. They walked into the fray. The crowd was a pressing, suffocating tide of silks, satins, feathers, and perfume. Arthur used his sheer size to cut a path toward the perimeter of the grand dancing pavilion, shielding her from the worst of the crush. "I will secure us a private box," Arthur said, his voice raised to be heard over the orchestra. "Wait here by the colonnade. Do not wander." He turned and disappeared into the throng of bodies. Beatrice stood by a towering marble pillar. She was surrounded by the ton, the very people who had spent the last month treating her like a stain on the carpet. A few feet away, she spotted the unmistakable spun gold hair of Lady Githa, wearing a frankly scandalous gown of silver tissue and a jeweled half-mask. Githa was holding court, laughing viciously at something a man in a feathered plague doctor mask had just whispered. Beatrice looked down at her heavy, suffocating black cloak. She was sweating. The humid air of the gardens pressed against her. She reached up and untied the thick velvet ribbons at her throat. The cloak slipped from her shoulders. It fell to the gravel path, pooling around her feet like a defeated shadow. Beatrice stepped forward, out of the darkness of the colonnade, and into the blazing, multicolored light of the pavilion lanterns. The transformation in the atmosphere was not instantaneous, but it was absolute. It started with the men standing nearest to the pillar. A young viscount in a green mask stopped mid-sentence, his champagne flute hovering in the air. His gaze dragged over the sharp, elegant lines of the midnight blue silk, the exposed column of her throat, the defiant tilt of her head. The silence spread like ink dropped in water. Beatrice did not fidget. She did not look at her shoes. She stood perfectly still, letting the dress do the work she had engineered it to do. Without her spectacles, the faces of the crowd were a blur of color and masks, which made it infinitely easier to stare them down. She swept her gaze across the pavilion. She saw mouths open. She saw women snap their fans shut in rigid, sudden tension. The gray mouse was dead. In her place stood a creature of deep water and sharp edges. A man detached himself from Lady Githa's circle. He was tall, wearing a crimson mask and a silver-embroidered waistcoat. Lord Linfield, a notorious rake whose debts were almost as legendary as his conquests. He approached Beatrice with the predatory grace of a hound scenting fresh meat. "A tragedy," Linfield drawled, stopping 2 paces away and sweeping into a low theatrical bow. "To find a creature of the night standing alone under the lanterns. Has your escort abandoned you, mystery?" Beatrice looked at him. She recognized the desperation beneath the charm. He was looking for a wealthy widow, a bored heiress, anyone who could fund his gambling habits. "My escort," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a cool, silken register, "is merely retrieving something. And I'm not alone, sir. I am observing." Linfield smiled, a flash of white teeth beneath the red silk. "And what does the night observe?" "Predators," Beatrice replied without missing a beat. "And prey, though in this light, it is terribly difficult to tell which of you is which." Linfield blinked, momentarily thrown by the barb. Then his smile widened. He reached out, offering a white-gloved hand. "Then let us dance, and we shall see who eats whom. The waltz is beginning." Beatrice looked at his hand. She was about to refuse to slice him down with a polite, devastating dismissal when a large, dark shadow fell over them both. "The lady's dance card is full, Linfield." The voice was low, rough, and violently absolute. Beatrice turned. Arthur stood there. His chest was heaving slightly as if he had run back from the private boxes. His blue eyes were blazing behind his black mask, locked onto Beatrice with an intensity that made the breath catch in her throat. He did not look at Linfield. He was looking at her. He was looking at the way the blue silk hugged her ribs, the way the black organza shifted over her hips, the sharp, elegant defiance of the jet-beaded mask. Linfield puffed up, indignant. "Now see here, fellow, You were merely leaving," Arthur interrupted softly. The threat in his baritone was unmistakable. It was the voice of a man who commanded regiments, a man who did not ask twice. Linfield looked at Arthur's sheer size, the tension vibrating through his broad shoulders, and wisely calculated his odds. He offered a tight, jerky bow and vanished back into the crowd. Arthur remained perfectly still. The music swelled around them, a breathless, soaring Viennese waltz. The crowd around them had begun to whisper, eyes darting toward the striking woman in blue and the menacing giant in black. "Arthur?" Beatrice asked, her voice quiet. For a fleeting second, panic flared in her chest. Did he recognize her? Would he drag her out by the arm, furious at the deception, furious at the expense? Arthur stepped closer. The heat radiating off his body was palpable. "I leave you for 3 minutes," Arthur said, his voice a gravelly murmur, "and I return to find half the pavilion ready to kill each other over the right to fetch you a glass of punch." He raised his hand. Slowly, deliberately, he extended it toward her. "Dance with me," he commanded. It was not a request. Beatrice placed her gloved hand in his. His grip was entirely different from Linfield's damp, practiced hold. Arthur's hand was massive, his calluses pressing through the thin kid leather of his gloves. He pulled her toward the center of the dance floor, parting the crowd simply by walking through it. When they reached the center of the swirling couples, he turned to face her. A waltz required a scandalous amount of physical contact. Society had protested it for years before finally surrendering to the thrill. Arthur placed his right hand firmly on her waist. Beatrice gasped softly. Through the layers of silk and boning, she could feel the burning heat of his palm. He was holding her much tighter than proper etiquette dictated. "You are staring, Your Grace," Beatrice whispered as he stepped forward, pulling her into the sweeping rhythm of the dance. "I am recalibrating my reality, madam," Arthur replied, his voice barely audible over the soaring violins. He swept her into a devastatingly fast turn. The centrifugal force pushed her closer to his chest. He was an excellent dancer, ruthless, precise, and entirely in control. Beatrice let her own body respond, relying on the mathematics of the steps, trusting the structure of her dress to keep her upright as the world spun into a blur of candlelight and silk. "Who made this gown?" Arthur demanded, his eyes scanning the intricate beadwork of her mask, the line of her throat. "I did," Beatrice said. She lifted her chin, refusing to break his gaze. "With a seamstress in Covent Garden, using the allowance you provided." Arthur's hand tightened slightly on her waist. "You lied to me. For 3 weeks. You let me believe you were hiding in your chambers." "I am the gray mouse, Arthur," Beatrice said, the cynicism bleeding into her tone. "Mice hide. That is what you expected. That is what everyone expected." "I did not expect this." He spun her again, reversing the direction with a sudden fluid power that left her breathless. "You look—" He stopped, his jaw tight. "I look like a woman who refuses to be collateral damage any longer," she finished for him. They moved across the floor. The other dancers were subconsciously giving them a wide berth. Beatrice could feel the eyes of the ton tracking them. "Do you know what they are saying?" Arthur murmured, dipping his head so his mouth was agonizingly close to her ear. A shiver racked her spine at the contact. "They're placing wagers on your identity. Geetha just told Lord Harrington she believes you are a smuggled Italian opera singer." A sharp, genuine laugh broke from Beatrice's throat. The sound surprised them both. It was rich and bright, carrying over the music. Arthur pulled back slightly, staring at her mouth. The hard, cynical lines of his face had softened, replaced by a raw, hungry shock. "You should laugh more often," he said quietly. "You should give me reasons to," she countered. The banter was terrifying. It was a high-wire act without a net. For weeks they had existed in a state of polite, frozen distance. Now, the heat of the ballroom and the anonymity of the masks were melting the ice. "Why tonight?" Arthur asked as they navigated a crowded corner of the floor. "Why drop the disguise now?" "This is not a disguise, Arthur," Beatrice said, her voice dropping, losing its defensive edge. "The drab wool, the silence, the submission. That was the disguise. I wore it for my father to survive his temper. I wore it for society to survive their pity. But I will not wear it in my own marriage." Arthur missed a step. It was a microscopic error, instantly corrected, but Beatrice felt it. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the fierce intelligence in her obscured eyes, the unyielding strength in her spine. He realized, with a sudden sinking weight in his chest, that he had fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. He had bought a manager to run his estates. He had accidentally married a queen. "I told you I wanted a ghost," Arthur said, his voice rough. "Hut! And I told you I required a foundation," Beatrice replied. The music was building to a frantic climax. "Ghosts do not hold foundations together. I am flesh and blood, your grace. If you want a silent, invisible creature to haunt Westford House, you will have to look elsewhere. I am done being invisible." The final chords of the waltz crashed through the pavilion. Arthur pulled her into a sharp, concluding halt. They were chest to chest, both breathing heavily. The applause of the crowd washed over them, but neither broke eye contact. His hand remained clamped to her waist, long after it was proper to let go. "I do not want a ghost," Arthur whispered, the words torn from him. Before Beatrice could process the confession, a shrill, artificially sweet voice pierced the fragile bubble between them. "Arthur, darling!" Lady Geetha Morales pushed through the surrounding dancers, her silver tissue gown catching on a chair. She arrived breathless, her jeweled mask glittering under the lanterns. Several members of her sycophantic inner circle trailed behind her, like remoras attached to a shark. "We have been watching you from the boxes," Geetha declared, aggressively waving her fan to cool her flushed face. She did not look at Beatrice. She directed her entire performance at Arthur. "You simply must introduce us. The suspense is killing the entire pavilion. Who is your mysterious midnight conquest? And where, pray tell, is your poor drab little wife, hiding in the carriage with a book of sermons?" A smattering of cruel laughter rose from Geetha's followers. Arthur went terrifyingly still. The hand on Beatrice's waist didn't loosen. It turned to iron. The protective, violent instinct that had surfaced when Linfield approached returned, magnified tenfold. He opened his mouth, the muscle in his jaw ticking, preparing to verbally eviscerate his cousin. But Beatrice placed her free hand on his chest, right over his heart. She felt the heavy, furious pounding of it beneath the fine broadcloth of his coat. She pressed gently, silencing him. "Do not let them see you bleed," he had told her weeks ago. She wasn't going to bleed. She was going to draw blood. Beatrice stepped out of Arthur's hold, turning slowly to face Lady Githa. The surrounding crowd went dead silent, sensing the impending collision. "My husband has no need to introduce me, Lady Githa," Beatrice said. Her voice was unhurried, perfectly modulated, and chillingly clear. It carried perfectly in the hushed pavilion. She reached up, her gloved fingers catching the edge of the velvet mask. Beatrice untied the velvet ribbon at the nape of her neck. The movement was deliberately slow. She lowered the jet-beaded mask, revealing the sharp slope of her nose, the pale skin of her cheeks, and the unblinking, muddy brown eyes that had stared down debt collectors and drunken rage without shedding a single tear. Then, she reached into the hidden pocket she had sewn into the folds of her organza skirt. She withdrew her spectacles. She unfolded the wire frames with a soft click and slid them onto her face. The world snapped back into sharp, unforgiving focus. Lady Githa's face was a study in sudden, violent shock. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving two stark patches of rouge standing out against her powdered skin. Her mouth opened, closed, and opened again, like a fish pulled from the Thames. "You were inquiring about my whereabouts, Lady Githa," Beatrice said. Her voice remained at a conversational volume, yet it cut through the dead silence of the pavilion. "I am precisely where a duchess ought to be, at my husband's side." A collective intake of breath rippled through the spectators. The young Viscount who had dropped his jaw earlier now dropped his champagne flute. The crystal shattered on the gravel. "Beatrice," Githa whispered, her voice stripped of its practiced syrupy cadence. She looked from the midnight blue silk to the wire-rimmed spectacles, her brain entirely failing to reconcile the plain country mouse with the woman who had just commanded the room. "But the dress, the hair—" "It is a masquerade, Githa," Beatrice pointed out, her tone laced with mild, devastating pity. "The entire purpose of the evening is to conceal one's true nature. You came dressed as a charming, gracious woman. I came dressed as yours." Someone in the back of the crowd choked on a laugh. It sounded remarkably like Lord Harrington. Githa flushed a mottled, ugly red. She gripped her fan so tightly the ivory sticks groaned. You deceived us. You made fools of us. You made fools of yourselves," Beatrice corrected smoothly. "You looked at a quiet woman in gray wool and assumed she was deaf, blind, and stupid. You assumed poverty was a moral failing and plainness was a lack of wit. I did not deceive you. I simply allowed you to be exactly who you are, in broad daylight while I took notes." She adjusted her spectacles, pushing them slightly up the bridge of her nose. It was the same gesture she made when finding a discrepancy in the household ledgers. It was a gesture of dismissal. "If you will excuse us," Beatrice said, turning away from the sputtering, humiliated woman. "The air in here has grown terribly stale." She did not look back. She offered her hand to Arthur. Arthur Grafton, the Duke of Westford, stood frozen for a fraction of a second. He looked at his wife. He looked at the shattered remains of Githa's social dominance. A slow, dark, and utterly feral smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a predator watching a rival pack tuck their tails and run. He took her hand, placed it firmly in the crook of his arm, and covered her gloved fingers with his large, warm hand. "Make way," Arthur commanded. He didn't need to raise his voice. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide, unobstructed path to the exit. They did not just step back, they bowed. They curtsied, they lowered their eyes. They had wanted blood sport, they had witnessed a slaughter. The walk back to the carriage was silent, but the air between them hummed with a live electric current. The humid night air felt cool against Beatrice's flushed skin. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the waltz and the confrontation was beginning to recede, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion in her bones. Arthur handed her into the carriage. He climbed in after her, signaling the driver with a sharp rap on the roof. The carriage lurched forward, leaving the glowing lanterns of Vauxhall behind. In the dim interior, the silence stretched. Beatrice leaned her head back against the squabs. She pulled off her spectacles and rubbed the bridge of her nose. Her fingers were trembling. The battle was won, but she felt entirely hollowed out. "You are shaking," Arthur observed. His voice was rough, scraping the quiet of the carriage. "It takes a considerable amount of energy to ruin a woman," Beatrice replied, keeping her eyes closed. "I am unaccustomed to the exertion." Arthur shifted on the bench opposite her. "You did not ruin her. You simply held up a mirror. She ruined herself." Beatrice opened her eyes. Arthur was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his mask discarded on the seat beside him. The passing gas lamps illuminated the hard angles of his face, the permanent tension in his jaw. But his eyes were different. The cold, assessing glare of the man who had bought her in Mr. Abernathy's office was gone. He was looking at her with a terrifying, raw intensity. "I underestimated you," Arthur said. It was a blunt admission, devoid of pride. "I thought I had purchased a sensible, quiet manager for my affairs. I did not realize I had married a tactician." "You did not purchase me, Arthur. You paid my father's debts." "It amounts to the same thing in the eyes of the law, Beatrice." He ran a hand through his dark hair. "I wanted a ghost. I told you that. I wanted a woman who would ask nothing of me, who would take my name and leave me in peace, because I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who want pieces of me, my wealth, my title, my influence." He looked down at his large, calloused hands. I was cruel," he continued softly. "I left you in that house to fend for yourself against the wolves of the Ton, thinking your plainness was a shield. I thought if they ignored you, you would be safe. I was a fool." Beatrice watched him. This was the most he had spoken to her since their wedding day. The hard, impenetrable Duke was bleeding his own truths onto the carriage floor. "I am not angry with you, Arthur," Beatrice said, and she meant it. "You kept your end of our bargain. My sister is safe. The creditors are gone. You gave me the tools to build a wall, and I used them to build an armory. We both got what we wanted." Arthur looked up, his blue eyes locked onto hers. "Did we?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Because watching you in that dress tonight, watching you tear Githa apart with a few quiet words, I realized something, Beatrice." "What?" she breathed. "I realized that I no longer want a ghost." The carriage jolted over a pothole, throwing them both slightly off balance. But Arthur did not look away. The space between them felt suddenly very small, very hot, and entirely devoid of the mutual indifference they had sworn to uphold. The dawn broke over Mayfair in a wash of pale, watery gray. It was a typical London morning, smelling of coal smoke and damp pavement. In the morning room of Westford House, the world had fundamentally shifted. Beatrice sat at the mahogany table. She wore a simple olive-green day dress. Her hair was pulled back into its sensible knot. Her spectacles sat firmly on her nose. She looked precisely as she had every morning for the past month, but the atmosphere in the room was entirely different. Mrs. Higgins, the formidable housekeeper, entered carrying a silver tray. Instead of the usual curt nod and abrupt departure, Mrs. Higgins placed the tray down with extreme care. "Fresh tea, Your Grace," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice softer, laced with a new hesitant respect. "Cook has also prepared the poached eggs just as you prefer, and the post has arrived." "Thank you, Mrs. Higgins," Beatrice said, not looking up from the household ledger. Mrs. Higgins lingered for a fraction of a second. "If I may, Your Grace." "The staff. We heard whispers from the footman who attended the carriage last night. They say you put Lady Githa quite firmly in her place." Beatrice finally looked up. Mrs. Higgins's face was a mask of professional neutrality, but her eyes gleamed with vindictive satisfaction. The servants, it seemed, despised Lady Githa as much as Beatrice did. "Gossip is a poor breakfast companion, Mrs. Higgins," Beatrice said smoothly. "But you may inform the staff that Lady Githa will no longer be calling at Westford House." A small, genuine smile broke across the housekeeper's face. "Very good, Your Grace." As Mrs. Higgins retreated, Beatrice turned her attention to the post. The silver tray was overflowing. Usually she received 2 or 3 mundane letters a day. Today there were dozens of heavy, cream-colored envelopes, sealed with expensive wax. She sliced one open with a silver letter opener. It was an invitation to a private dinner party from a duchess who had only a week prior loudly complained about the smell of wet wool in Beatrice's presence. The next was a request for her patronage from a fashionable modiste. The next was a groveling note of apology from the young Viscount who had dropped his glass, blaming his earlier behavior on bad oysters. The ton was entirely predictable. They despised weakness, but they worshipped power. And last night, Beatrice had demonstrated that she possessed a terrifying amount of it. The door to the morning room opened. Arthur walked in. He was dressed in riding breeches and a relaxed linen shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept at all, but the rigid, braced posture that usually defined him was gone. He looked profoundly human. He walked to the sideboard, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and pulled out a chair opposite her. "You're up early," Arthur noted, taking a sip from his cup. "The ledgers do not balance themselves," Beatrice replied, tapping her pen against the inkwell. "And it appears I have a considerable amount of correspondence to decline." Arthur glanced at the mountain of envelopes. A wry smile touched his lips. "The scavengers have returned to pick the bones of last night's scandal. I imagine you are the most popular woman in London this morning." "I am the most feared woman in London this morning," Beatrice corrected. "There is a distinct difference. They do not like me, Arthur. They are simply terrified that I will turn my tongue on them next." "And will you?" Beatrice looked at him. The harsh morning light caught the dark shadows under his eyes. "I have no interest in their petty wars. I only fought last night because they cornered me. I prefer the quiet." Arthur set his cup down. The clink of china against mahogany sounded loud in the quiet room. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. He was intruding on her space, crossing the invisible boundary of the massive table that usually kept them safely apart. "We need to talk about last night," Arthur said. Beatrice's stomach gave a familiar anxious flutter, but she forced her face to remain impassive. "We discussed last night in the carriage. You admitted you misjudged me. I accepted your admission. The matter is settled." "The matter is entirely unsettled." Arthur's voice was firm, dropping into the low, rough tone that made her breath catch. "Our bargain was built on a foundation of mutual indifference. You were to manage my house and I was to ignore you." "Yes. I cannot ignore you, Beatrice." He said it plainly. There was no poetry in it, no flowery declarations of sudden, overwhelming love. It was a statement of fact, grounded in raw, unavoidable reality. "I watched you last night," Arthur continued, his blue eyes holding hers captive. "I watched you build a suit of armor out of silk and glass. I watched you dismantle my vicious, cruel cousin without raising your voice. You possess a strength that shames every man in my club, including me." Beatrice swallowed hard. The pen felt heavy in her fingers. "Strength is a requirement for survival, Arthur. It is not a romantic virtue." "I am not a romantic man," Arthur countered. "I do not believe in fairy tales or sudden infatuations, but I believe in respect. I believe in partnership, and I am asking if you are willing to renegotiate our terms." He reached across the table. His large, scarred hand came to rest inches from hers. He did not touch her, offering her the choice to bridge the gap or pull away. "What are the new terms?" Beatrice asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "We stop hiding from each other," Arthur said. "You stop pretending to be a mouse, and I stop pretending to be a ghost. We run this estate together. We face society together, and we see what else we might build if we stop fighting alone." Beatrice looked at his hand. It was the hand of a man who had offered her a cold, brutal lifeline when she was drowning in her father's debts. Now, it was offering something far more dangerous. It was offering vulnerability. She thought of the midnight blue dress hanging in her wardrobe. She thought of the heavy, intoxicating heat of his hand on her waist during the waltz. Slowly, Beatrice laid her pen down. She reached across the polished wood and placed her fingers over his. His skin was warm. Instantly, his hand turned, his fingers lacing through hers, gripping her with a solid, grounding strength. "Agreed," Beatrice said quietly. Arthur exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry years of solitary tension with it. He squeezed her hand. They did not kiss. They did not fall into each other's arms. They sat in the quiet morning room, the smell of coffee and ink between them, two hardened survivors holding on to each other, realizing that for the first time in their lives they were no longer fighting alone. The shift in their marriage did not arrive with a clap of thunder or a sudden sweeping confession in the rain. It was built the way Beatrice built everything, stone by stone, carefully measured, relentlessly tested. The invisible wall that divided Westford House came down quietly. Arthur stopped taking his meals at his club. The massive mahogany dining table, which had once felt like a barren wasteland separating two strangers, became a workspace. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the Vauxhall masquerade, they sat together in Arthur's private study. A fire crackled in the hearth, warding off the damp London chill. Beatrice was curled into a deep leather armchair, her stockinged feet tucked beneath her skirts, an estate map spread across her lap. Arthur sat at his desk, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, frowning at a stack of tenant petitions from the northern properties. "The miller in York is requesting an extension on his lease payment," Arthur said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "He claims the river flooded the lower storehouse." Beatrice did not look up from her map. Did he specify which storehouse? "The eastern one. Deny the extension," Beatrice replied smoothly, marking a boundary line with a pencil. "The eastern storehouse sits on a limestone rise. It hasn't flooded since 1792. "He is lying, Arthur. He likely lost the coin at the local gambling hell. Offer him a choice. Pay the lease by month's end, or we replace him with the apprentice who actually runs the mill." Arthur stared at her. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock and the hiss of rainwater against the window panes. Then, a low, rumbling chuckle broke from his chest. Beatrice glanced up, her pencil pausing. Arthur was smiling. It was not the feral, terrifying smile he had aimed at Geetha. It was a genuine, warm expression that crinkled the corners of his blue eyes and entirely transformed his harsh features. "Remind me never to play cards with you," Arthur murmured. "I am merely efficient," Beatrice said, though she felt a sudden traitorous warmth bloom in her cheeks. Arthur stood up from his desk. He walked across the Persian rug and stopped beside her chair. He did not retreat to a polite distance. He stood close enough that she could smell the scent of him, sandalwood, clean linen, and the faint sharp tang of ink. He reached down. Gently, with a careful precision that contradicted his massive size, he took the pencil from her fingers. He placed it on the side table. Then, he reached for her spectacles. Beatrice's breath hitched, but she did not pull away. Arthur slid the wire frames from her ears, folding them and setting them beside the pencil. The world blurred slightly, narrowing her focus entirely to the man standing over her. He braced his hands on the arms of her chair, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "You are relentless," Arthur whispered, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "You are ruthless. You are the most terrifyingly brilliant creature I have ever encountered." "You wanted a manager," Beatrice breathed. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I wanted a partner," Arthur corrected softly. "I just didn't know how to ask for one." He closed the distance. The kiss was not desperate or crushing. It was an inquiry, a negotiation of breath and heat. His lips were firm, warm, and tasting faintly of the black coffee he drank all day. Beatrice let her eyes flutter shut, her hands instinctively coming up to grip the lapels of his waistcoat. She had expected him to be rough. He was anything but. He kissed her with a slow, devastating reverence, as if she were made of glass. But beneath the gentleness, there was a vast, coiled strength, a promise of protection, a promise of permanence. When he finally pulled back, resting his forehead against hers, they were both breathing heavily. "I am not a ghost, Arthur," she whispered into the quiet space between them. His large hand slid into her hair, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "No," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "You are the foundation. You are everything." The Tun tried, of course, to breach the fortress of their new alliance. Invitations poured in, dripping with sycophantic praise. They attended only what was absolutely necessary. When they did step into the ballrooms of Mayfair, they moved as a single, impenetrable unit. Beatrice did not wear the midnight blue silk again. She did not need it. She wore elegant, sharply tailored gowns in deep greens and rich burgundies. She wore her spectacles. She did not hide in corners. And Arthur never left her side. The brooding, solitary Duke of Westford transformed into a man who looked at his plain, sharp-tongued wife as if she had hung the stars in the sky. If anyone dared cast a mocking glance her way, a single freezing stare from Arthur was enough to send them scurrying for the far corners of the room. They had conquered London. But Beatrice knew, with the cynical wisdom that had kept her alive, that London was merely a battlefield. It was not a home. In late June, they abandoned the suffocating heat of the city and traveled to Westford Manor, Arthur's ancestral estate in the rolling hills of Gloucestershire. It was entirely different from the gilded cage of Westford House. The manor was ancient, built of pale, weathered stone, draped in climbing ivy, and surrounded by thousands of acres of untamed forest and fertile farmland. It smelled of earth, pine needles, and rain. For the first time in her life, Beatrice had nothing to fight. Her father was dead. The creditors were paid. Her sister was secure in Bath, writing joyful letters filled with schoolgirl gossip. The vicious socialites of London were miles away, rendering their whispers entirely powerless. One evening, just before sunset, Beatrice walked out onto the grand stone terrace that overlooked the valley. The sky was bleeding gold and bruised purple. The air was cool, carrying the scent of blooming lavender from the lower gardens. She leaned against the heavy stone balustrade, watching a flock of starlings turn and dive in the fading light. She heard the heavy rhythmic tread of Arthur's boots against the stone before he spoke. "The steward has finally admitted defeat regarding the crop rotation in the southern fields," Arthur announced, stepping up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "He says your mathematics are, regrettably, flawless." Beatrice leaned into his warmth, a sigh escaping her lips. "He's a stubborn man. He will try to plant wheat there again next spring. We will have to watch him." "We will," Arthur agreed. They stood in comfortable silence. This was what victory felt like, Beatrice realized. It wasn't the sharp, vindictive thrill of humiliating Geetha Morales at Vauxhall. It wasn't the breathless adrenaline of a masquerade. Victory was quiet. Victory was a man who held you as if you were his own heartbeat. Victory was knowing that when the sun rose tomorrow, you would not have to face the world alone. Vadkich. "I used to hate Gloucestershire," Beatrice said quietly, watching the shadows lengthen across the valley. "It was a prison, a place where my father drank and shouted, and where I spent every hour tallying coppers, terrified of the men who knocked on the door." Arthur's arms tightened around her. He pressed a kiss to her hair. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just held her, a silent, immovable anchor against the tide of her memories. "When you bought me in Mr. Abernathy's office," she continued, "I thought I was trading one prison for another. A grander, richer prison, but a cage nonetheless." "And now?" Arthur asked. The rough edge of his voice trembled, betraying a rare vulnerability. Beatrice turned in his arms. She looked up at him. The fading light caught the sharp angles of his face, the fierce, enduring blue of his eyes. She reached up, framing his face with her hands. Her thumbs brushed over the permanent lines of tension around his mouth, lines that had softened over the past few months, eroded by laughter and quiet evenings by the fire. "Now," Beatrice said, her voice fiercely steady, "I know the difference between a cage and a fortress." Arthur exhaled sharply. He caught her wrists, pulling her hands down to press fervent kisses to her palms. "I love you," he said. He didn't whisper it. He didn't say it like a fragile secret. He stated it with the same absolute, unyielding conviction with which he commanded a room. It was a fact, solid, real. "I know," Beatrice replied. A genuine, radiant smile broke across her face, a smile that transformed the gray mouse into something breathtakingly beautiful. "And I love you, Arthur, more than is entirely sensible." He laughed, a rich, booming sound that echoed across the stone terrace and swept her up into his arms. Beatrice gasped, laughing with him, as he carried her back into the warmth of the ancient stone house. The ton would go on gossiping. The debt collectors would hound other desperate families. The world would continue its brutal, cynical spin. But within the walls of Westford Manor, the Duke and his plain bride had built an empire of their own. It was not built on silk or masks or the fragile illusions of society. It was built on respect, forged in defiance, and sealed with a love that refused to ever be invisible again. If this story of Beatrice and Arthur, finding a genuine, unyielding love amidst the toxic gossip of London society, moved you, please hit that like button. Every like helps this channel bring more deeply human, grounded historical romances straight to your screen. What was your favorite moment? The brutal honesty in Mr. Abernathy's office, or the stunning unmasking at the Vauxhall Ball? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with fellow romance lovers, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of underdogs taking back their power.